Thousands of ships make millions of journeys across the world's oceans. But some never arrive at their destination. Some sink because of the actions of captain or crew. Others because of a defect in their design. The Philippines, a nation of islands. Here, 72 million people hop on ferries as routinely as Americans hop in cars. Overcrowded ships are a way of life. So no one thought twice when thousands of travelers crammed aboard a ferry like this one called the Dona Paz in December 1987. Their journey would end in the worst disaster in the history of passenger ships. Most on board were off to spend Christmas with their families. All was uneventful until 10 o'clock that night, and then they heard a loud bang.
We stood up and looked around. We saw something on fire at the front of the ship.
Doon sa bandang proa ng barko.
We ran to one side to see what it was. We saw a tanker next to the Dona Paz.
Nakatabi na sa Dona Paz. Nag-aapoy na yung dagat.
The sea was on fire, and the tanker exploded. The fire became bigger and bigger.
The Dona Paz had been hit by a coastal tanker loaded with nearly 9,000 barrels of flammable oil, and both ships were ablaze. The Dona Paz sank in minutes. Only those who immediately jumped overboard stood a chance, but it was slim. The oil had ignited. Now, the sea itself was on fire. Only 24 survivors were found, most of them with horrible burns. Eight hours had passed before the Coast Guard finally responded to the distress call. By that time, there was little wreckage and no one to be rescued. 132 bodies were recovered from the sea so badly burned that few could be identified. How many people died? Official figures put the number of passengers at no more than 1,800, but thousands of angry relatives besieged the offices of the shipping company, saying many more were missing. The final death toll was estimated at over 5,000. 1,000 of them were children. The official inquiry blamed the tanker for the collision, but the tragedy highlighted an inherent weakness in some ferries, their tendency to suddenly capsize. 14,000 people have died in ferry accidents since 1980. Roll-on, roll-off car ferries have revolutionized shipping. A large open deck with doors at both the bow and the stern allows cars and trucks to roll up at one port and roll off at another, all within minutes of docking. To make them easier to load, ro-ro ferries do not have watertight barriers or bulkheads on the car decks. Over 20 million passengers a year travel on such ferries from England across the English Channel to the continent of Europe. On the evening of March 6, 1987, a ferry called the Herald of Free Enterprise left the Belgian port of Zeebrugge on its return journey to England. It was a fine night and promised to be a routine crossing. Ken Hollingsby, a steward in the duty-free shop, was serving a long line of customers.
I stood up for a break. A friend of mine took over, and as he sat down and I stood up, the ship lurched. A bottle of brandy came out of the shelf and broke on my chest, or on my head, but all over my shirt. First thoughts were, have I got a clean shirt? And I have. So I turned to go and get a clean shirt, and as I turned, so it lurched again, more bottles started coming out, and so I started shielding passengers from the bottles that were flying around. But as I turned to shield them against the bottles, I could see all the windows disappearing on the opposite side of the lounge, and these enormous waterfalls coming in, and people going out of the windows holding onto each other's feet, and I thought, it's incredible, how are they doing that?
There was a big crash as though somebody had a lot of plates all smashing and everybody cheering. And those cheers stayed in that loud area of cheering and went onwards into screams. I was observing a cold drinks cabinet that was sliding. It was getting faster, till eventually it left the deck and flew through the air and smashed against the people who were right alongside me. But while I was doing this, one of the portholes exploded inwards. Water started pouring in.
The ferry was on its side in 60 feet of water, a mile outside the Belgian harbor. Of the 600 passengers and crew, many were killed when the ship turned over. Surviving crew members launched a desperate struggle to rescue those who were still trapped inside. One of the first to clamber up the slippery hull was Ken Hollingsby. He helped drop rope ladders down into the darkness of the ship.
People did start using them. Some refusing to let go of their duty-frees and their handbags and all the rest of it, but one I can understand with a dead child. I mean, she didn't want to let go of him, but she did eventually, only if I promised to follow her up carrying the baby.
Rescue teams eventually arrived on the scene.
We zijn nu bij dat schip. Het ligt dus met de steven aan de wal. Buiten de noordelijke dam. Ten oosten van de Geur. En het schip ligt dus over het bakboord met zijn schoorstenen in het water.
Inside the darkened ship, all was chaos. Smashed furniture and bodies, the water steadily rising. The walls had become the ceilings. Harry Bispham found himself trapped under a glass partition with water up to his neck.
There was no way we could break the glass. Very, very quickly, you have to work out, take the last breath that you can. How long that lasts, I don't know, but as soon as that's gone, then you've got to come to terms with the inevitable. You're going to drown, you're going to die.
Two hours had elapsed since the ship turned over. Passengers were now dying not by drowning, but from hypothermia as they waited to be rescued.
I didn't think anyone was going to die on it. I thought everyone, there were so many people coming up them ladders that I thought we're going to get them all off. But then the first few dead ones started coming out, which I didn't like very much. I did make a vain attempt at reviving one woman, but I was pulled off and told it was too late. There was men we pulled out on ropes, and once they passed an arm, the arm came straight out the sleeve, and it was obviously been severed, and he was in so cold or whatever, he never felt it.
It felt like an eternity, because each time the rope went up to get one of the survivors with it, it would disappear, and you'd think for a while that they'd forgotten about us, lost us, and we waited for ages. I don't know how many it'd take, maybe 6 or 10 rescuers to pull one person out.
Harry Bispham was one of the last to struggle out.
I then could feel a gentle breeze in the evening, and it was freezing. And I was better off actually being inside of the ship, but also, of course, I had to make my way along the full length of this ship, and I walked along the full length of Townsend Torrison, almost like a crazy zebra crossing.
400 survivors were taken ashore, but the death toll was rising. By morning, still no one knew how many were missing. There was no passenger list. Only when the ship was righted could the corpses be counted. 193 people had died, 38 of them crew.
38 funerals was a lot to attend in a month, and I just felt I had to do it. I don't know why I felt I wanted to go to every funeral, but I just did. I just needed to know that they had been laid to rest and had finally got off of there. Because some of those, 4 of those, I used to take to work in my car. And when I went back to work first time afterwards, it was empty, apart from me, and it was a really strange feeling.
The survivors and the families of the dead all wanted to know what happened. How could it have happened?
We went from safe to sunk in 90 seconds. So there's got to be something wrong there. With a big ship like that, 90 seconds. There's got to be something very wrong with the design of the ship.
What was wrong was there for all to see. A television camera had captured the gaping mouth of the ship. Her bow doors were wide open. Amazingly, it was a common practice. Because of the pressure on ferries to turn around quickly, captains routinely left port with the bow doors open. They were closed as the ship headed out to sea. But on the Herald, the man in charge of the doors was fast asleep. On the bridge, no one knew the Herald was a death trap, and the killer was a fatal flaw.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday.
The disaster aboard the ferry Herald of Free Enterprise tragically had been foretold. At the inquiry, investigators uncovered several internal company memos from captains asking for a light on the bridge to warn them if the bow doors were open. In response, one company official scrawled, "Do they need an indicator to tell them that the deck's doorkeeper is awake and sober?" The inquiry pointed the finger at the man who had fallen asleep on duty, but also the company that operated the ferry. When it was all over, a wider issue remained unresolved: the vulnerability of roll-on, roll-off ferries to capsizing. A warning from history had come 2 decades earlier, on January 31st, 1953, when the British ferry Princess Victoria, en route from Scotland to Northern Ireland, sank. Out of 182 passengers and crew, 139 died. From then on, around the world, ferries continued to capsize at the rate of 1 a year. The Princess Victoria's stern doors had given way in a storm, but the Herald of Free Enterprise had sunk on a calm night in shallow, protected waters. How could she possibly have capsized? To find out, investigators built a scale model of the ferry, identical in every essential detail, and tested it with the bow doors open. Results indicated a phenomenon that no one had suspected.
We'd found in our model tests that there appeared to be a so-called critical speed, that if you were just below that critical speed, the bow wave on the Herald's type of bow, rolled forward and rolled clear of the deck. If you went just slightly above that speed, and it only needed a quarter of a knot or something like that, then water would begin to move back onto the deck and in amongst the vehicles, slowly at first. But as the speed increased, there was this very sudden and very dramatic change where the deck was essentially engulfed as vast quantities of water went on very, very quickly.
Investigators thought the critical speed was 17.5 knots. Above that, the bow wave would be high enough to reach the car deck and pour into the ship. To test their theory, a full-scale experiment was conducted in Belgium with the Herald's sister ship, the Pride of Free Enterprise. Everything was the same, from sea conditions to loading to the trim of the ship. Everything except the bow doors. This time they were shut. Cameras were placed at key positions to record what happened. One camera was on the nose of the ferry as she gathered speed.
Looking down on the bow fender, which was known as the bow spade, and the bow doors, with the center of the bow doors down here. There's some light spray coming over the spade at the moment, but most of the bow wave is being deflected forward by the shape of the bow. The speed is around about 14 knots.
As the ship's speed increases, the bow wave grows, eventually reaching the level of the doors. If the doors were open, the spray from the bow wave would be falling on the car deck.
Now getting up to 17 knots, where we're getting close to the critical speed, and there's much more solid water coming over most of the time, well above the handrail, and in many cases very nearly to the top of the doors. The speed is now above the critical. It's almost continuous white water coming over the forward spade now. And in the Herald itself, a lot will be coming through the bow doors and entering the vehicle deck in considerable quantities. Well, at this point, there would be massive amounts of water coming on board to the Herald. It would be cascading aft.
Investigators now knew how the water had gotten onto the car deck. The Herald, with its bow doors open, was thought to be proceeding at 18 knots, just above its critical speed. Just 1 knot slower, and the tragedy never would have happened. Now, only one question remained. How could water on the car deck sink such a large ship so quickly?
When you get water on the car deck, you are susceptible to a phenomenon known as, in naval architecture, as free surface effect, which is the same as saying the stability is reduced. An example of the problem of this water sloshing is if you try and carry a tray of water around and keep it steady. It's almost impossible to do, and you can feel the way the water moves backwards and forwards and makes the whole tray and water combination a very unstable device.
Just as the investigation was winding down, a freak accident dramatized the danger of a small amount of water slopping around a car deck. One evening in September 1987, the British car ferry St. Christopher was crossing the English Channel in a storm. Within minutes of its departure, the ship lurched violently. Passengers and objects were tossed from side to side. A large truck had turned over, crushing cars and shifting cargo. As a result, the bow doors had burst open. Several inches of water had poured onto the car deck, rolling the ship from side to side as it sloshed around. The incident could have been disastrous, but unlike the Herald, the St. Christopher managed to limp back to port. Why had the Herald tipped over so quickly? Once again, investigators turned to the model test. As seawater slops onto the car deck, the ferry leans over slightly, causing the ship to turn. Centrifugal force increases the list of the ship. The water on the car deck now rushes downhill, making the ship lean over more. The turn gets tighter until the ship flips over completely.
This whole phenomenon took about probably 40 to 50 seconds, something like that. And that, in terms of an accident at sea, is a split second. There is no chance for anybody to do anything when that happens.
The captain and crew were powerless to save the Herald of Free Enterprise. The accident changed everything. Today, all such ships must have passenger lists and boarding passes. Video cameras monitor the bow doors, and all new ferries must now meet rigid stability requirements, and all existing ships by the year 2005. Passenger ships have claimed the highest toll in human life, but on the high seas, there's another ship afloat that may be the deadliest.
Mayday, 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 Mayday.
Cargo ships are vital arteries of world trade. Heavily laden with iron ore and other essential raw materials, these giants of the sea make the global economy possible. They also sink with alarming regularity. In November 1986, the Kowloon Bridge set out across the North Atlantic, carrying over 160,000 tons of iron ore from Canada, bound for the steel mills of England. But she never made it. During a stormy crossing, cracks appeared in her deck. Then the steering failed. Her 28-man crew was airlifted to safety. The next day, the runaway ship ran aground on the southern coast of Ireland. Salvage tugs worked for days, but were unable to pull the ship off the rocks. Finally, heavy seas relentlessly pounded the ship and broke its back. On November 24th, 1986, the Kowloon Bridge slipped off the rocks and sank into deeper water. Only the funnel was visible above the surface. Since 1991, 45 of these huge freighters have sunk, broken up, or simply disappeared. Another 60 suffered serious structural damage but made it back to port. The death toll has been heavy. As many as 500 mariners have died each year. Most of these accidents go unmentioned, but the sinking of the Kowloon Bridge would reopen an investigation into one of the greatest shipping mysteries of the last 50 years. The Kowloon Bridge was one of 6 giant cargo ships constructed during the 1970s, the largest ever built in Britain. 1/3 of a mile long and 170,000 tons. It was 3 times the size of the Titanic, and equally unlucky. So was her sister ship, the Derbyshire, which disappeared in the China Sea during a typhoon in September 1980. There was no Mayday. A small oil slick was the only clue to the whereabouts of the wreck. 44 sailors perished. The official government investigation concluded that the Derbyshire was probably overwhelmed by the forces of nature. Normally, it would have ended there, but this time the families of the dead were not about to accept the finding. They argued that the loss of these sister ships hinted that something was seriously wrong with their design. 170,000-ton ships don't just disappear, however big the waves. There must be more. But the families were powerless. The investigation was closed, and no one would listen. In the end, it was a trade union, the International Transport Workers Federation that took up their cause.
Unless you thoroughly investigate an accident and find out what was the causative factor, you're not really going to be able to prevent future accidents. And we owe that to the people who survived, and we owe it to the families of those who've died.
In an extraordinary move, the trade union raised the money to launch its own investigation into the sinking of the Derbyshire. But first, a search vessel had to find it. Day after day, it scoured the area. Finally, sonar equipment picked up an echo from the seafloor, which looked like it might be the wreck of the Derbyshire, 2.5 miles down. Investigators needed to be sure, but the union's money was running out. On the last day, they sent down a deep-water camera to look at the object. A scan of the hull finally revealed part of a name.
That's it. We got it, Larry. We're on the name. Is that the IRE? Yeah. Yeah. It's just incredible, man. That's the Derbyshire. You can see the... That's the Shire. Look at the Derby.
They'd found the Derbyshire, but they hadn't solved the mystery of how such a giant ship could sink without warning. They did, however, succeed in convincing the British government to undertake a full-scale deep-sea investigation of the wreck.
No government now can get away with not thoroughly investigating any shipping accident, no matter where it is or how deep it is. The technology exists and you can do a thorough job, and I think we've shown that. We've embarrassed them into doing it.
The British government turned to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts, which 3 years earlier had found the Titanic 2.5 miles down in the Atlantic. The Woods Hole team used sonar, high-definition video, and digital still cameras to survey the wreck. The debris covered a vast area on the floor of the Pacific.
The vast majority of what you see here is just sediment. There's a slight slope to the bottom, but in this red box is where the majority of the debris is actually located, and you can see how scattered it is.
After an airplane crash, investigators recover the pieces and rebuild the wreckage to find the cause. But finding all the pieces of a sunken ship over 2 miles down is virtually impossible. Instead, the ship was reconstructed electronically. Remote-controlled cameras took nearly 136,000 photographs of the wreck. Then computers joined them together. Piece by painstaking piece, the Derbyshire was reassembled. Naval architects suspected that if there was a design flaw, it would show up on frame 65, where the number 9 hold joins the stern. This digital reconstruction shows the number 9 hold as big as a cathedral and the stern of the ship. There's no separation between them. The Derbyshire did not break up at frame 65 as originally thought. Investigators were back at square one. Now they turned to the proximity of the debris, especially the location of the stern.
These are the bow and the stern. Those are, of course, the two largest portions of the debris that exist on the seafloor.
The bow was found only a few hundred yards away from the stern. That revealed a clue. If the ship had broken up on the surface, the stern, which was heavy, would sink quickly, while the bow could drift miles away.
When you find in 4,000 meters of water depth that they are only 600 meters apart, that really is almost categoric proof that they were intact at the surface and the separation came later.
If the Derbyshire did not break up on the surface, What caused her to sink? Perhaps the original finding was correct after all. The ship had simply been overwhelmed by a storm.
I started myself creating mathematically these cyclonic storms and the waves that would come from them. And those waves, I found to my amazement, were 25 to 30 meters high. And this is way beyond the sorts of design heights that we design ships for. And whilst many ships might not experience them in such a storm as this, if it had to be caught in the worst part of the storm, then it has to be able to sustain that.
Again, the photographs would provide the answer. Some of the Derbyshire's hatch covers showed evidence of damage. Did it happen as the ship sank, or did it occur on the surface? On a large cargo ship, hatch covers can weigh up to 30 tons. But weight doesn't mean strength, as investigators would soon discover.
In the deck, the hatch covers occupy 30% of the deck area, and yet their strength is less than 1/10 of that of the rest of the deck. There's such a mismatch there, and it only wants one big wave over 25 meters, and you're absolutely certainly going to burst a hatch cover.
Professor Faulkner concluded it would take only one damaged hatch cover to bring about the loss of this huge ship and 44 lives.
We do expect that the number one hatch will burst through the big wave thumping it, and that'll be all damaged and so on. And then as that compartment fills, the ship is virtually at the point where it's becoming a certain loss, because the whole of the foredeck will be underwater perhaps by as much as 3 meters at that point. Then the number two hatch cover is virtually certain to follow by the next even moderate wave. As soon as number two compartment's gone, then the ship takes a very heavy bow trim, and in a matter of less than 3 minutes would be plunging irreversibly into the sea. The captain would have nothing really to say, I'm getting water at the fore end. And so really, until you get to the point where the number one hatch cover is burst, and then he would know. But by then, he's lifted up in his seat as the bow starts going down, and there's nothing he can do.
There was no time even to send a Mayday. The Derbyshire was an unusual case, especially since it was a new ship, only 4 years old when it sank. The regular disappearance of large freighters, one every 2 months, is the biggest scandal in shipping today. Most lie at the bottom of the sea, the cause of death unknown. The eerie remains of this ship, adrift in the North Atlantic, presented investigators with a bizarre mystery to solve. In January 1998, a 26-year-old freighter, the Flaw, was 14 days out of Rotterdam, Holland, bound for Canada. The ship was plowing through stormy seas when it was struck by a towering wave. Within minutes, the ship was dangerously listing to starboard. The crew, mostly Filipinos, told their radio operator, nicknamed Marconi, to send a distress call. At 4:30 a.m., the Coast Guard in Newfoundland picked up a panic-stricken call from the Flaw.
What station calling Mayday? This is Skipville Coast Guard Radio, channel 16. Say again, over.
4637 north. 4637 north.
Please confirm 4657 north, 5651 west. Is that correct, over? How many persons on board, over?
There was no further message. The Canadian Coast Guard assumed the worst and alerted search and rescue services. They had no idea what ship was in trouble or how many lives were at stake. On the Flaw, the crew thought their Mayday had been heard when a ship appeared.
Everyone rejoiced. We said, there's a boat. There's a rescuer. As it passed by, we saw it was the other half of our ship. We lost all hope.
The stern, which they were standing on, sank immediately, while the bow of the flare began an eerie dance around the North Atlantic. Search and rescue helicopters from Nova Scotia were instructed to fly to the last known position of the flare. But what they didn't know was that in the heat of the moment, the Mayday call had given the Coast Guard the wrong position. The chance of finding the flare and its crew of 25 alive was now remote. But 6 men were still clinging to an overturned lifeboat in the bitter cold.
The wind was very cold. Every time we got wet, we shivered. The waves were big. 2 of our companions were washed away.
The weather was pretty murky. We were kind of having to dodge around snow squalls that were in the area. And we were trying to get back on track as we came across the oil slick on the water. I mean, obviously, we're looking for a boat in trouble. That's a good thing to look for, so we started to track along the slick.
There was nothing we could do. Marconi asked for help. We just looked at him and couldn't help him. Each one of us was helping ourselves.
By following the oil slick, the helicopter spotted the upturned lifeboat. The men had now been in the water for 5 hours.
We said, we'll live, when we saw the helicopter coming to rescue us. We took turns waving. The others waved, and then I waved.
I thought when I saw them and looked down and see the kind of condition they were in initially was, you know, and you poor bastards, you know, but then you realize after a couple of minutes that, you know, you guys are really lucky to be where they are and where we are all at the same time.
Within half an hour, the survivors were on their way to a hospital in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Of the 25-man crew, only 4 survived. Nearly frozen, 2 were barely alive. "15 bodies were recovered, including the radio operator, Marconi. The 6 others were never found.
On our second search, we found the bow section and started to fly around that, and it was probably one of the most eerie things I've ever seen. From the front, it looked like a perfectly good ship, and then it's just completely torn in half, and it was just huge.
The flare was now a ghost ship haunting the North Atlantic. Tormenting investigators from Canada's Transportation Safety Board, it sank before they had time to arrive. The flare slipped silently beneath the waves with all its vital secrets, except one.
Mayday, 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 Mayday.
Now at the bottom of the sea, the flare had left no black box and no clues to why it sank. Investigators would have to rely on the latest technology to find out what happened. First, they tried to make sense of that last desperate Mayday.
The actual Mayday call is fairly garbled and difficult to understand. So to try to increase its intelligibility, we have a number of techniques we can employ to improve it. One of the first we can do is to slow the sound down but maintain the same pitch of the voice. So you don't sound, you still maintain the pitch of the voice. And to do that, we have a little time compression expansion algorithm. We'll slow it down by about 200%. And then we can play that segment. And then in addition, we can try to remove some of the background noise. And all we do to do that is we grab a section of noise here, and then we can do a footprint of that noise. So this is the spectral content of that noise, and then we can ask the system to remove that noise from the source recording, and we can play that and see how it sounds.
Despite a thorough sound analysis, the tape yielded no information. Now investigators turned to the documents found on the bodies of the dead crewmen. They used another innovative technique to see if these scraps of paper held any hints. Every piece recovered was frozen in a saline solution, then freeze-dried to restore the writing.
Freeze-drying is a process whereby you go from a solid state to a gaseous state. So the water is converted directly from solid ice into gas. And that process actually reconstitutes the paper. And it allows us to restore the documents back to the almost original conditions. From the flare, what we recovered were various documents that were recovered from the chief officer of the flare. They were actually recovered from his body.
One document revealed the names and ages of the crew. Others related to the ship.
The things that were recovered were various pieces of scrap paper on which he had written coordinates and dates. And from examining the course of the ship, we can get a good idea of where the ship was on these dates.
The documents showed that the flare was doing about 6.5 knots in the storm. It was proceeding at a safe speed. The information was useful, but still no inkling as to why the ship broke up. Could it be a structural failure? Freighters had already shown they are vulnerable to certain stresses.
In general, with all vessels, in rough sea conditions, they're subject to all sorts of shock loads. The ship is at sea, and if the waves are similar to the length of the ship, and you have a wave supporting the ship at the stern and a wave supporting the ship at the bow, it will sag because it isn't supported by as much water and buoyancy in the center. Similarly, if you have as the wave passes by and the ship goes through the waves, you have a wave in the center of the ship, it will flex and bend the other way, which is called hogging. This constant bending and flexing of the ship, in effect, is what induces fatigue. Bending stress is usually greater at or close to amidships. The fracture across the main part of the deck on the starboard side is virtually at midships, which is the mid-length of the ship.
The evidence was beginning to point towards metal fatigue. But Lancelot Bedlington needed to know more about the kind of fracture that had split the ship in two. If it was a clean break, a so-called fast fracture, that meant that something had snapped it like a piece of chalk, suggesting metal fatigue. If the break was ragged, that would indicate the ship had been damaged and had gradually torn itself in two.
The fracture across the deck runs from one side of the hatch on the port side right across to the ship's side on the starboard side in virtually a straight line. The edges of the steel are not buckled or twisted, which is a general indication that it's a fast brittle fracture.
What could have caused a fast metal fracture? A patch of ice on the ship's deck looked suspicious.
One particular tank, abreast of number 3 hatch, shows this ice, which would lead us to believe that that tank was not completely filled.
If the tank had been full of seawater ballast like the others, there would have been enough residual warmth in the water to stop the ice from forming. Bedlington suspected that the tank was partly empty, while the others were full, so the ship was unevenly balanced.
The ballasting throughout the ship was not exactly uniform. The crosswise loading of the ship would not be symmetrical, and it can produce a twisting effect.
Sonar echoes reflect the ghostly shape of the flare on the sea floor, 300 feet down. Until the wreckage can be examined, no one can be certain why she sank. But investigators believe the lightly loaded ship had been bending and buckling as it pounded through the waves. The final straw was the partially empty tank, which caused the hull to twist until it snapped in two. The Canadian investigation is still underway, but the lessons of the flare and other freighters show that once these vessels get into trouble, they have very little margin of safety, a fact that 500 seamen take to their grave each year. Every ship is at the mercy of the sea. A storm can strike without warning, a mistake can be made at any time. A ship's destiny may depend on surviving a fatal flaw.
Adrenaline Rush Hour follows real-life heroes when disaster strikes. From tornadoes to volcanoes, they're the ones who step in and save lives. Savage Earth, next on TLC.